Welcome to On the Line. I'm Christine Williams. Coming up, coping with loss and grief during the Christmas season. Stay tuned. Christmas is supposed to be the season to be jolly and festive. Not everyone can feel this way. Many are facing a sense of grief due to divorce or the loss of a loved one. So if you're in this position, how do you cope? Or you may be close to someone who is. What is the best way to act around such a person? Sensitivity comes to mind, but how do you apply it without being awkward, perhaps? Joining me today to help us out with these very serious issues, Counselor Dr. Bill Webster. Now, our lines are open. If you have any questions or comments, you may want to tell us a story about coping in the past, please call in at any time. Our lines are open. Dr. Webster, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thanks, Christine. It's a pleasure, as always.
I felt it would be a service to the public, Dr. Webster, to deal with a subject such as this. Divorce rates, for example, and we will be dealing with grief due to the loss of loved ones, but divorce it's a reality today. Many people perhaps are facing a first Christmas without that once upon a time loved one, or without perhaps having the children under the same family roof, as the case may be. I'd like to hear your comments about this.
I appreciate the fact that you're drawing to our attention the fact that death isn't the only significant loss that causes grief. For example, divorce, but even separation, because the children are going to be away. They've grown up, they've moved away to university, they're married, they're living in another province, another country. When someone loses their job around Christmas, all kinds of losses, loss of relationship, loss of security, and all of these losses actually trigger grief. I think that you mentioned divorce specifically, and yes, I think that's right. I think what makes divorce particularly difficult is that somewhere along the line, someone has made a choice. Someone dies. For example, my wife died, as you know my story, and she didn't have a choice. I didn't have a choice. But when there's a choice involved, when it's by choice rather than by chance, I think that adds a complication to the process.
Wow. Now, I'm going to want to hear a little bit about your own personal story, what that first Christmas was like without your first wife. But I want to draw back attention for a moment on something crucial that you said. Now, I mentioned divorce. Divorce is very serious. I mentioned death, but you also included separation, loss of jobs, that kind of a thing, which all fall under the category of something grievous. If you can just characterize grief, it's difficult to find the words to say, well, this applies to everybody across the board because it's so unique. But can you give us a possible definition, something that can cover it as best as possible?
This is a 1-hour program, Christine.
Oh, yes, it can take 5.
We could take a long time.
Yes.
But let me just simply say that I've come to believe that grief is a normal reaction to an unusual event. I mean, we could say to an abnormal event. That has a better ring to it. But, is death abnormal? That's an argument we could have. But it's a normal reaction to an unusual event. And any time we have any significant loss, we're going to experience grief. Grief is an emotional reaction that says, I'm missing something. Something's changed in my life. My world has been turned upside down, and I don't like it. The problem, I think, that is in our society, in our culture, people are often not given permission to grieve. We talk about this as being a death-denying culture. It's actually a loss-denying culture. We don't like to think about loss. We don't like to talk about loss. We prefer to think about winning and success.
We don't like pain, period.
We don't like pain.
Nobody does,
exactly.
But we take it to the extreme.
But it's a part of life and living. And I think we need to embrace that. So if we don't like to talk about death or loss, we also don't learn about grief and how to respond to grief.
Yes.
So that people will sometimes say, well, it's been 3 months, you ought to be over it by now. The reaction is that when your world changes, and that's what happens when someone dies, or when you go through a divorce, or Or when the children move away, that's a happy event in many ways. I mean, that's life, and you work towards that great day, and yet, what's the loss? It's the loss of the role of being a parent. And so it's recognizing the loss, and recognizing that the grief is saying, something's changed in my life, and I don't like it, and I've got to now redefine myself. I've got to kind of find new ways of living and new meanings for my life. And so grief is the process that enables us to work that through and to arrive at a place where we can make the decision that life goes on.
Now, you talked about the culture that we live in. We're a very fast-paced culture, and everybody has to win. That's just how we are as a culture. We know nobody likes pain. Of course not. But at the same time, what position does this leave the person that's facing grief with? It's almost as if the person is forced to be two selves. They're grieving down inside, but they must show a different side of themselves to everybody around them.
Well, once again, that's an excellent way of describing exactly what many grieving people face. Margaret Mead once said, "When someone is born, we rejoice. When someone is married, we celebrate. But when someone dies, we pretend that nothing has happened." And shortly after a death, no one wants to talk about it, no one mentions it. There's a conspiracy of silence. I suggest it's the same with any significant loss. And so when people are kind of saying, well, you know, it's been 3 months, you ought to be over it by now, we like people to feel that we're doing okay. We don't like to think that we are losers. We don't like to have people feel that we're not able to cope, because that's a sign of weakness. And we hate appearing to be weak. So we pretend. A few months after my experience of loss, you know, people are saying, well, come on now, you ought to be getting yourself together.
Okay, can I stop you for a moment? People are telling you that. Now, in your experience personally and as a professional, people are actually telling people in grief this, come on, you got to get over it.
That's right.
Now, I find that cruel, and it's something that I've heard people say, that people say these things. What can a person in grief for the first time expect when it comes to this? Because I would imagine those words can be shocking to somebody hearing this from a friend.
Where do I start, Christine? Because, you see, I really do believe that that's exactly what people experience. However, I think people mean well. I think people are sincere. I don't think people are trying to be malicious or cruel or unkind. But the reality is that if my loved one dies, my world has changed, but your world stays the same. And we like people to get back to what we considered normal. We would like the person to be back to the way they were. We'd like everything to be fixed. And the reality is, situations can't be fixed sometimes in life. And so people struggle with it. And if we could just get you back to normal, if you weren't emotional, if you were the same as you were, then everything would be back to normal. There's a sense of security about normality. And so I think that people, again, really mean well, but they say, or someone dies in January or February, and 10 months later, it's been 10 months, my goodness, what's wrong with you? But they don't realize it's the first Christmas. And the first is the worst. And so it's not a matter of time. We need to get away from time frames and so on to understand. Because if you understand the why, what we do about it actually falls into place.
Well, getting away from those time frames, that's a huge point, something I want to elaborate on some more. We're going to have to go for a break now, but remember, our lines are open for you to call in at any time if you need advice, you have any questions, or you may want to share your story. We'll be back after this. Stay tuned. Hello again, welcome back to our program. We're talking about dealing with grief this Christmas. Joining us, Dr. Bill Webster, who is a counselor. We're going to go now to you on the phone line. Susan on line 6, you're on the air.
Hi.
Hello, Susan.
Hi, how are you doing?
Fine, thank you, Susan.
Yeah, my voice has normally not been this low, but I do a lot of crying, so we now have a different octave in our voice. Yeah, I saw your show this morning. I haven't actually seen it before. I sit and I flip channels most of the time. My son shot himself a year ago, and we're talking about a boy that was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and And he went to the best university, graduated. He was 24 years old and dropped dead gorgeous. And I'm still can't believe that. What happened? Why did he do that? I have a home, and my husband keeps saying to me, "Can I take out the Christmas stuff and put the Christmas?" And I look at him like, "Christmas? You want to do Christmas?" And I'm realizing he's a human, and he needs to continue on with Christmas. But there's no way I'm doing a turkey. You know, like, how can I do a turkey? And Christmas, and you want people over, and I don't know how to continue to carry on. I wear my bathrobe a lot. I used to wear really nice clothes, you know. I used to be a different human being. I've been told that there's a Susan before and then there's a Susan after, and I'm the Susan after.
Susan, first and foremost, I want to tell you how sorry I am that you had to go through such a horrific circumstance and such grief. You're a very articulate person. I think you've given us a lot of information about how you're feeling, and Dr. Bill Webster, can you please address this particular tragedy here and the grief that's so obvious in Susan's voice?
And that's exactly what I hear, Susan. I hear that this isn't just about Christmas. This is about grief. This is about losing someone you cared about a great deal. You know, you said to understanding the question why. One of the difficulties of a situation like this is that sometimes there is no answer to the question why. Harold Kushner once said, "Why is not a question. Why is a cry of pain. It's a protest." And so, in a sense, I hope you're getting some counseling help and some support. And you can contact us if you need to find some of that kind of support. Because working through the grief process, sometimes, especially in a sudden, unexpected, and traumatic death, such as the one you've described, it can take us months, if not a year, before the grief actually comes out and comes through. And so you may be finding, if it's exactly a year ago, that you're reliving some of those situations. And so we'd love to help you. It's not just a simple answer. It's working through a process. But I will say this, Susan, there is a reason for every behavior. There's a reason for your husband's behavior as to why he wants to, you know, carry on and have Christmas and have turkey and have friends and so on. And there's a reason why you're still in your bathrobe and why you're doing the things that you're doing. It's called survival. It's called finding ways to live beyond the experience of loss. And so I wish you well. I wish I had some kind of easy answer or easy cliche that I could give you. We don't. We might as well be realistic. But there is help out there, and I hope that you'll call in and get it.
Susan, please take advantage of that. Now, Dr. Webster, your website, griefjourney.com, yeah. Is that where Susan could email you?
Susan could email me through the website at griefjourney.com. There's also a number of resources on there, particularly around the Christmas season. We've got a video, we've got a meditation, and articles, and there's many other things on there. So I invite people to go and take a look and find us there at griefjourney.com.
The point that Susan made, that she just wants to be in her bathrobe, perfectly understandable, but her husband wants to take out the Christmas decorations. I can see this being quite classic in many situations involving loss and tragedy, that you look at a couple, one wants to try to become as normal as possible under the circumstances, whatever that word means to that person, but the other one can't get out of the bathrobe. They're still feeling it as if it was yesterday. They're depressed about it. How do you move on from there? Any guidelines on a happy medium, one understanding each other? What do you do there in a case like this?
I think, and I'm not speaking specifically about Susan's situation.
No, just in general, when you find a couple like this.
But I think that everyone is different. And in a sense, I'm not surprised by what Susan's telling me, because often the male responds by, well, let's just get on with it. Let's just pull things together and so on. Whereas I think females tend to feel it more. And so it makes perfect sense to me that these are the contrasting reactions. What I think we need to do is to help people to sit down and to try to understand the other person's need and to come up with some kind of a compromise.
Overall, Bill, when it comes to grieving, questions that people might ask themselves, emotions like anger, guilt, can you give us a little bit of insight on the emotions a person can expect during the grief process, the variety of emotions, how they could strike?
The emotions are many, and everyone's different, of course, But I think some of the ones around Christmas can be particularly confusion, lack of concentration. You know, there's so many things to do around Christmas, so many tasks, so much pressure. And the
So you're
person
looking at
just,
stress in addition to the grief. Okay.
that's right. The person just feels like they can't cope with it all. And so I think they have to be realistic and find ways to reduce the pressure, to say, okay, maybe I can't do it all this year. Maybe I need to find a way of finding an alternative to writing cards, decorating trees, putting up the lights, getting gifts, all of the things around Christmas. People, I think, would particularly feel anxious. And I think that, again, anxiety is generally around a lack of confidence. What surprises many people is that after a death or after a divorce or a loss, there's a fundamental loss of confidence that occurs, because if I can't control this, what can I control? When the worst thing you can possibly imagine happens, well, what else can happen? So, you know, that's another very important emotion. Guilt and anger. Sometimes survivor guilt. Here we are enjoying another Christmas. Here we are with the opportunity to have a good old time, and someone isn't here. Should I be having a good time? Is that disrespectful? And so there can be guilt and sometimes anger. One of the great dangers with anger is that anger gets misplaced. It's taken out on the family, it's taken out on other people, it's taken out on situations. What we're really angry about often is that we've been left and there's nothing we can do about it.
Wow. Now, Bill, we're going to have to go for a break, but there's a case I want to talk to you about when we come back. I heard about this, that a lady suffered the loss of somebody very close and dear to her. The other members of the family said at Christmas time, look, if you're going to cry, we don't want to have you. The message is clear when you hear those words. I consider them cruel. This is something I want to address when we get back. Stay tuned. Hello again, and welcome back to On the Line. I'm Christine Williams. We're talking about grief at Christmas time. Dr. Bill Webster is joining me. Now, Dr. Webster, I was telling you about the story I heard about, where a lady suffering grief was told by other family members, if you're going to cry, don't come at Christmas time. Don't attend. In other words, the words behind that is, you're going to ruin everybody's Christmas, so stay at home and grieve by yourself.
I've heard similar stories. I heard a story last year of a family who, before they left for the family Christmas, the children were told, now for goodness sake, don't mention Grandpa's name because Grandma's just going to get upset. But the reality is Grandma was upset anyway. And in fact, Grandma was more upset because Grandpa's name wasn't mentioned.
Interesting.
I think, you know, yeah, we would all like to think that everything's the same, but I think one of the most important principles of what we're talking about today is we need to recognize that this Christmas is going to be different. It takes 100 times more energy to try and pretend that everything's the same than to acknowledge that someone is missing. If this is a family, it's going to be on everybody's mind. The only decision that we can make is, are we going to pretend that it's not, or are we going to be realistic about it?
Now, I could understand that explanation better, because the people are perhaps feeling awkward and they don't want to upset Grandma, so they're considering Grandma. But when somebody tells somebody, you keep your grief to yourself because I don't want you destroying everybody else's time, I have a hard time with that kind of a mentality.
I think that I can understand that you would have a hard time. I think that you would probably find it's more common than you would realize.
Sadly so.
But I mean, on the other hand, this lady has a decision to make. You know, does she want to be involved in the situation, or can she find another situation where people might be a little bit more sympathetic? So I think that even the grieving person has decisions that can be made and can be empowered, you know, to say, well, in that case, you know, I won't be coming. And that's hard, but maybe that would have the family stop and think, oh my goodness, wait a minute, what have we done? Why? See, if people understand the why, what they do about it will fall into place. And so maybe the family needs to be confronted by the fact that on these conditions, I won't be coming. And if they're a caring family, which I would suppose that they are, because again, I don't believe that people are really trying to be cruel and unkind. I think that they're trying to manage something that they don't really know how to manage.
One thing that comes across loud and clear, Dr. Webster, is the word awkwardness comes to mind for everybody involved, because on one hand you have the grieving person that may be feeling, I don't want to be part of the Christmas celebrations because I'm just not up for it. I'm down. For myself, it's going to be awkward, and for the other people, it's going to be awkward. And on the other hand, you're finding the other people that are thinking, what should I say? Or what shouldn't I say to this grieving person, because I don't want to make any situation worse. Any overall guidelines, particularly when it comes to Christmas gatherings, when everybody is feeling, I have to be happy and show it?
Well, for the grieving person, I would say, no, I don't think you do need to be happy and have to show it. But I do think that, one of the things that I've found over the years that people have told me is that when they isolate themselves, when they don't go to the party, when they don't go to the family, no, I'm just going to stay by myself Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, Boxing Day, the holiday season. Later on they say, I wish I'd done something different.
So it's worse to isolate yourself?
From what my observations have been, that it is worse to isolate yourself. But when you do go to a party or a social function or a family get-together, when you go in to say, look, you know I've been going through a tough time and it's been very difficult, and if I find this too difficult, I know you'll excuse me if I just leave. And so that gives you a kind of a way of escape.
So you confront it.
You confront that, I'm having a difficult time, and if I need to, I'm going to leave. I hope you'll understand. And people who care will understand. For the families or the friends themselves, if they cared about the person who died, it's going to be on their minds too. So we need to be realistic about that. But I think sometimes asking permission. Would you like to talk about the person, or would you prefer we didn't? Could be a good suggestion. Because again, that empowers the grieving person. It says, what would you like? What would be helpful? We often make decisions for a grieving person. Well, we're going to do this, we're going to do that.
Or we won't mention it because it's going to upset them.
Exactly. Or we won't mention it. And we make the decisions, and that disenfranchises the grieving person. We need to find out what they want. Because the reality is, Christine, one person might want to talk about it, another person might not want to talk about it, because everybody's different. There's no one predictable way. There's no one predictable strategy whereby we help people work through grief.
Now, there are definitely people who don't like to talk about situations. There are those that are more private. But I've also heard it said that in terms of mentioning the person's name, that is gone, that it's actually a good thing to do, that it's music to the person's ears to mention their name, as opposed to what people might think. I shouldn't mention that name because I'm going to upset the person. What's your view on this, Dr. Webster?
Well, I hope we have a few minutes, because this is a very,
for sure.
very important point.
Yes.
Very important point.
Yes, we do.
You see, the one thing that a grieving person does not want, they do not want their loved one to be forgotten. And when after 3 months nobody's talking about it, nobody's mentioning it, there's this sense of panic. How come? Why didn't they say it? 3 months after my wife died, I began to wonder if she'd ever existed, because no one's talking about it, nobody's mentioning it. It was just one of these topics that everyone avoided. I think that we need to talk about the person. We need to acknowledge their presence, even in the midst of their absence. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. I think the person's present because they're on everyone's mind. And sometimes it's good to talk about the person. One of the suggestions that I have is that at Christmas dinner, Christmas Eve, whatever's appropriate, to light a memorial candle for the person, just in memory of the person. Now, that's not easy. It can be emotional. It can be difficult. And yes, you're right. Sometimes there can be that awkward silence. But a year or so ago, someone told me that they'd done that. And after a few moments of the awkward silence and the tears and the Kleenex, someone said, I was just thinking about the time when... And they spoke about a funny incident that had happened a few years ago. And someone else said, it's strange because I was just thinking about, and they spoke about another incident. Now, what they found themselves doing was talking not about the person's death, but about the person's life. And talking about the person's life, you see, we have to let the light of the person's life brighten the death, rather than letting the death cast its shadow upon the person's life. And so talking about the person's life, because, talking about the death is difficult at any time. So let's not remember just the fact that they died. Let's remember the fact that they lived. And then it becomes not just a commemoration of death, which everyone's a bit shy about and so on. It becomes a celebration of life, which everyone can engage in, because we all have wonderful memories of, that holiday, that Christmas, that time, that incident, that humorous thing that happened. And so I think that when people talk and focus on that aspect of things. It makes things a lot easier.
Wow. Lots of tips, wonderful ones to consider. We're going to have to go for a break, but when it comes to issues of divorce, with divorce, there's a loss, there's a grieving process, but there are different characteristics. And this is an area of grieving, particularly at this season, we're going to address after the break. Stay tuned. Hello again, and welcome back to our discussion. We're talking about grief at Christmas time. Now, there's a reason we're doing this. Christmas is often seen as a time to be jolly and festive, but there are lots of people in our society now that are suffering from various losses, loss of loved ones, maybe a loss of a job, or how about a loss of a spouse due to divorce? This is also part of the grieving process. Now, joining us is Dr. Bill Webster. We talked about the whole issue of types of grief earlier on in the program. Divorce is something I also want to deal with as well, because it seems that it has although it has grief, it has a grief component. It's different some way than losing a loved one, with different types of emotions attached. For example, I can imagine one person saying, well, it's because of this one. A lot of finger pointing happens during a divorce, or even at the end of one. Because of this person, the family's now separated this Christmas, and the kids now can't enjoy the whole family unit because of him or because of her. So we're looking at many variables here because the person is still alive.
That's right.
Can you address this whole component of divorce?
While the majority of my work is revolving around people dealing with grief after a death, I think that many of the principles apply in other situations, such as divorce. I think what makes a divorce situation particularly difficult is reconciliation, is being finally able to put it to rest. Because when someone dies, well, it's finished. The word reconciliation actually means putting it to rest. It's complete. But life goes on, and the person can still hurt you in the present and in the future. I think it's particularly important, you know, that if the people couldn't get along in the marriage, for goodness sake, at least get along in the separation. If for nothing else, for the sake of the children. And if they can't, it's because usually someone's trying to control the situation. So many of the emotions of grief, the common ones, anger, guilt, blame, finger pointing, whatever, they're all rooted. They're really blossoms that are rooted in a feeling of helplessness and powerlessness. It's an attempt to control a situation or another person. And whatever the need there, you know, it's important to understand, but why is this happening? What is going on? People tend to repeat relationships. People tend to get themselves into frighteningly similar relationships all the way along. And so I think it's important that people have an opportunity to look at the relationship, to ask the why of what is actually going on. But to be able to, at least as human beings, to come to some agreement that, hey, you know what, we may not like each other, but for the sake of children or whatever, we're going to get along, we're going to be civil with each other. And to find someone who can help to negotiate that is, I think, vitally important in these situations.
Wow. Children in grief. Very much part of the whole grieving process. We tend to think of grief as something more, when you look at the studies out, toward adults. But do children grieve differently than adults?
Well, children do grieve differently to adults, Christine. Any child that is old enough to love is old enough to grieve.
Yes.
Okay? And that's the most important principle. So children grieve, but they do grieve in different ways depending on ages and so on.
Right.
And we're not going to go through all the different stages and ages of grief. I was 11 years old when my grandmother died. She actually went out 2 weeks before Christmas to mail some Christmas cards and was involved in a vehicle accident.
Oh, dear.
Severe injuries.
Tragic.
Christmas Eve, you know, she dies. So obviously that Christmas is a wipeout for our family. But every Christmas from then on, for whatever reason, I loved and respected my mom, but we never had Christmas again. We never put up a Christmas tree. Christmas was never the same. I think in her mind it was to try to say that it would be disrespectful to her mum if she had Christmas.
She felt guilty in a way. Was that it?
Maybe she did. I never really had a chance to discuss it with her.
Yes.
But what I do remember was that my sister and I, 11 and 8 years of age, never had another Christmas. And that's a shame, because you only have so many Christmases as a kid. I would encourage anyone, if you've had a significant loss, or even if you've gone through a divorce or whatever, someone's died, have Christmas for the kids. And here's why I believe that. Christmas is for children. Children look forward to Christmas. And when things go on, when life goes on as normal, when there's a Christmas tree, when there's gifts, when there's a party and so on, children feel more secure. Children feel secure when they know that everything's all right. If everything's cancelled and stuff, the child panics and thinks, well, what else is there? What else is going to go wrong? What else is going to fall apart in my life? So it's vitally important to recognize that children need Christmas because it gives them that sense of security, a sense of the familiar or whatever. Children's grief comes and goes. A child will get up on Christmas morning and here's the gifts and stuff and there's no grief there, it's just joy, joy, joy. Maybe later on there might be an hour when they're a little more pensive or whatever, and then all of a sudden they're back, and that's the way a child grieves. So if it's a difficult Christmas for the family, maybe the child could go to the neighbours or go to a friend's and break their toys for a change for an hour or so, and give the adults a break from what's going on. So that there are some strategies that we can do to help children. But I think it's vitally important to recognize the meaning of Christmas for children and the effect that it can have on their ongoing sense of well-being.
Adults are normally encouraged to get in touch with their feelings, to perhaps discuss it, even if it means with a counselor. What approach do you recommend with children? Is it a good thing to bring up the loved one, perhaps, that's gone, whether it be through death or divorce? Or is it better to steer away their attention? Is there a better time, perhaps, to address children? How do you know when to talk to a child? Because kids are so different. Like adults, but children.
Sure.
How do adults approach this?
I don't think it's ever wise to steer anyone away from anything. I think, you know what? The child will tell us. The child will lead us. The child, by their words, by their questions, by their behaviors. And
that's what you let them do, take the lead.
That's exactly right. You respond. A child of a different age, a young child, for example. My son was 7 when my wife died. His questions were very different. His questions were, when we went to the cemetery on Christmas Day, is Mom cold? Oh. What do dead people eat? Concrete questions looking for concrete answers. Dead people don't feel the cold. Oh, that's okay then. Dead people don't need to eat. Oh, that's okay then. There's no philosophical questions. Children don't understand abstracts. Children understand concrete. So you respond to their questions. Or if you feel that a child has a question, you might sort of pose it and say, maybe you've been wondering about such and such, and you frame the question that you think the child might be asking, and then the child responds, and you're able to kind of respond to it in that kind of way. Children usually let us know what they need, but what they need most of all, Christine, I believe, is love and security and the assurance that things are going to be okay. Yes, Mom, Dad has gone off, or Grandma or Grandpa has died, or some tragedy has happened, but we're going to be okay. Things are going to be right. I don't mean we give false sense of security or blow smoke here, but the child needs to know that, hey, I'm here, you're going to be all right, everything's going to work through. And that's the kind of reassurance, I think, that a child really needs. When they know that, they're going to work it through in their own way.
Now, Bill, you mentioned your child was 7 when your wife had passed away. Did you ever use words, or do you recommend anybody ever using words like, oh, Mom went to sleep? We're going to go for a break. We'll be back to talk about it after this. Stay tuned. Hello again, and welcome back to our program. We're talking about grief during the Christmas season. Now, Dr. Webster, a child, for example, has experienced a loss. You tell that child, whether it be whatever relative, close relative, for example, this person has gone to sleep. You suffered that loss with your wife. Your child was 7 at the time. Did you ever use those words? Do you ever recommend anybody using those words to a child?
Actually, I had 2 boys who were 9 and 7.
9 and 7,
and
that's
amazingly,
right, yes.
quite a difference actually in these ages in terms of the developmental issues. I believe what we need to do is to be open and honest with children. if people ask me, what did I do? I can give you the psychology answer, but basically I was open and honest with them, and I told them the facts and answered all the questions that they wanted. I used the D word, of course, being dead. My wife died. Their mother died.
Not sleep.
No, because, you see, again, if you use these kinds of concepts, they're abstract. A child goes to bed to go to sleep. So if you say to a child, you know, well, Mom went to sleep and we buried her at the cemetery, by the way, it's time to go to bed, you wonder why the child doesn't want to get to sleep. Or Grandpa went to the hospital, you know, for an operation and, you know, and hasn't come back.
And later on, the child's phobic about hospitals.
Exactly. You're going to have your tonsils out next week at the hospital, and the child's thinking. See, so, again, it's important to understand what does this mean to a child. And I actually think that it's easier to use the real words and the real concepts. I think it's not a children's issue. I think it's the adult issue. I think it's the fact that adults are unwilling to use the expression. It's an avoidance for them, not for the child. We sometimes say, well, we've got to spare the child the grief. I think the problems that it can cause can be tenfold to anything that we actually spare them.
Once again, grief is particularly harsh during Christmas time. When you lost your wife, somebody helped you during one Christmas. Tell us about that.
Well, actually, it was the second Christmas after my wife died. A friend of mine came and said, Bill, can I take your boys out to buy your Christmas present? Because kids 9 and 7 can't go out and buy a Christmas present. The first Christmas, I bought my own Christmas present. Now, at least I got what I wanted, Christine, you know, so that was okay. It wasn't too big a tragedy. But the second Christmas, somebody comes along and says, can I take your boys out to buy your Christmas present? Off they went, you know, my friend, my kids, my credit card. And when they came back, of course, the boys are all excited. You see, the reality is I would never have asked. I'm Scottish. I'm male. I'm too self-sufficient to ask for help, right? But when somebody said, can I do this for you? So if somebody's watching and you're saying, well, what could I do for a grieving person? Try and figure out what would that person need. You know, every situation is going to be different. What would this single mom need, or what would this elderly person need? And go to them and say, can I do this for you?
Be specific.
Okay? Make a specific offer of help, because the person will find it much easier to say, oh yes, thank you, that would be wonderful, than it would be to phone you up and say, by the way, Christine, would you mind taking my boss? Most people aren't going to do that. Most people aren't even going to think about that. So I think it needs to be very specific. I learned a big lesson from that. It was a very kind, generous gesture, something I appreciate very much. But I also thought, yeah, now, wait a minute, why did I respond to that so readily? And it was because someone obviously was thinking about what I might need.
Wow, what great advice. Traditions, they mean a lot to people. They're very important. They're enjoyed. Do people need to come to terms with, well, we've got to say goodbye to an element of tradition when something is lost, or do you recreate one, or do you just keep the tradition going? What's your point of view on this, Dr. Webster?
My answer is yes to all of these, actually, because every situation is going to be different. If we always had dinner at Grandma's house and Grandma has died and the house has been sold, then obviously the tradition has to be changed. But on the other hand, maybe the tradition doesn't have to be changed. I think it's a matter of personal preference. If you think about how many traditions there are around Christmas, not just Christmas Eve, Christmas dinner, putting up trees, putting up lights, sending cards, baking, parties, etc., etc. I think sometimes after a death or a tragic situation or a divorce, it's good for us to sit down and say, why do we do this? The reality is, Christine, that some of the traditions that we observe are done out of duty. We do it because, well, we've always done it this way and we have to, and it's really a bit of a pain in the neck, but oh, well, I guess we'd better do it. Or we do it because we think, well, my loved one would have wanted it to be this way. And that's very nice, but the loved one isn't here anymore. And now we have to decide what's right. So we have to plan ahead, decide what's right for us, make the changes that we want, and decide, is the tradition meaningful? Is this a meaningful expression of Christmas? You get 3 people to call in, you'll get 4 different answers as to whether or not we should put up a tree or whether or not we should do this or that. Everyone has to make their own decision. But is this going to be meaningful, or is this going to be one more burden on an already burdened life?
Wow, very interesting. You said this on a show before, and I'd like you to address it again after the break. You don't get over grief, Because there may be those asking, will I get over this? No, you get through it. We'll discuss that after this. Stay tuned. Hello again, and welcome back to our discussion, Grief at Christmas Time. Now, Dr. Webster, you've said in the past, it's not an issue of getting over grief, it's getting through it. What do you mean by this?
I think when someone dies, or if a spouse leaves in a divorce or whatever, life changes. Life is never the same again.
But that takes an acceptance in itself.
It can do. That's right. I mean, well, we have to accept it. It's a reality. We can't, we can't choose what happens. All we can do is choose what we're going to do about what happens.
Yes.
So, things happen. Stuff happens. People die. We can't change that. All we can decide is what we're going to do about it. And so I think grief is a process that we go through in order to bring us to the place where we make the choice. I wish I could say to you that every grief process ends in, a triumph and a good story.
That there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. It doesn't work that way.
People make their choices. Some people choose to be victims. Some people choose never to get over it. I
want you to elaborate on that point, because some of those people will say, I'm not choosing this. I don't like to be in pain, but I can't seem to shake it. But I hear what you're saying. Explain it.
I think that certainly in the first few months, the first year, I could well understand that. But there comes a point where you really have to make a decision, where you really have to say, well, I have to gather my resources, and I have to decide, how am I going to be affected by what has happened? Am I going to let myself become a victim, or am I going to be a victor, if you want to use the cliche?
Oh, great cliche.
So people make a choice. And sometimes the people who make a choice to be a victim, it's because that gives them a reward. Remember I said to Susan, every behavior makes sense to the person who's doing it?
Yes.
It's because people make a choice that gives them the reward that they're looking for.
What's the reward, Dr. Webster?
Some people would rather get attention than be ignored. A child would rather be punished than be ignored. So that's the reason for some of the bad behavior. Every behavior makes sense. So why are certain children, behaving badly? Children have a sense about when they're going to be abandoned. I mean, a child knows 2 hours in advance that a babysitter's coming in. There's a disturbance in the force. Something happens, and the child begins to react and behave to get the attention that they feel they're going to miss. So people get rewarded for behaviors. And some people think, well, if I behave negatively, or if I become a victim, all right, then I'll get some attention, and some attention is better than no attention. But I think there's always another choice. If we're not getting attention from the family who hasn't invited us, unless we promise not to cry, then we go somewhere else and we get other attention, because there are surely other people who can understand and sympathize. There's always another way.
Yes. In the middle of all this, you gave so much information about grief this past hour, but there was a hope, isn't there? What is the biggest hope for somebody that might be watching and thinking, look, I can't see myself getting through this? What is the biggest hope, Dr. Webster?
I think, well, there's two things I'd like to say. First of all, I believe there's always reasons to go on. There's always reasons to hope, but the grieving person may not see them today. We spoke to Susan earlier, and again, I'd encourage anyone to sort of go to the website and get the resources that they need. But to that person, they may not see hope today, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So we have to believe that there is hope, even though we can't see it. Just yesterday, people of the Jewish faith ended the celebration of Hanukkah. Hanukkah is a wonderful story. 400 years before Christ, the Maccabeans cleared out the temple of all the idol worship and restored the worship of God. They relit the menorah. But they could only find 1 day's supply of oil. In other words, the candle would only burn for 1 day, and then the oil would be depleted. The miracle of Hanukkah was that for 8 days, that 1 day's supply lasted, the candle burned, representing the presence of God, until a new supply could be brought in. Grieving people probably feel like they've only got 1 day's supply. I don't even know if I can get through today. My resources are limited. I don't know if there's any hope. I just don't think there's any light. I can't see any hope. The miracle is that we get through one day at a time, and before we know where we are, it's been 8 days, no, it's been 6 months, no, it's been a year, no, we've got over Christmas. That's the hope, that the light can continue to burn even though once in a while it flickers pretty seriously.
That sounds like a really great hope, but on behalf of the grieving person, does it take a level of work to say, look, I've got to move off from this position?
The good news is that we have a choice.
Mm-hmm.
The good news is that we can determine our own outcome. With the help of God, with the help of others, I'm not to minimize that in any way, but we get to decide if this is going to be a stepping stone or a stumbling block.
Mm-hmm.
A stepping stone is a positive thing. It helps to get you from A to B. A stumbling block trips you up, knocks you down. It's a negative. But stumbling blocks and stepping stones are really both just lumps of rock.
Yes.
It's what we do with them that makes the difference. And so people can say, okay, here we are, it's Christmas, it's a difficult Christmas, I'm in a difficult situation, but what am I going to do? How can, I'm not going to wish people a Merry Christmas, but can I wish them a meaningful Christmas? And we have a choice to be able to do that.
Wow. Well, Dr. Webster, it was an eye-opener, and I'm sure you've helped a lot of people out there. Thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure as always, Christine.
And that's all the time we have for today, and I am going off on holidays. Tomorrow and Friday, you'll meet a different host, Libby Stevens, who will be sitting in for me. And the following couple of weeks, we're going to be showing the best of our repeats based on your feedback. So have yourselves a wonderful Christmas season with your family, and a safe one. See you in the new year. I'm Christine Williams, and from all of us, thank you for watching.